Here's one of the great figures of identity politics today, Jair Bolsonaro, and he gives us a good starting point. So identity politics, contrary to what we typically think, is a right-wing phenomenon, not a left-wing one. And I hope to make that clear in what follows. So I look at the contrast between left and right as an opposition between universality on the left and identity on the right. So identity, as I see it, is always a right-wing phenomenon, and universality is always a left-wing phenomenon. And when they come into opposition with each other, that's the way in which debates between right and left work themselves out. You can imagine, I guess, a debate between Robespierre on the one hand and Mussolini on the other, the early Robespierre at least. Partisan of universality, Mussolini partisan of Italian identity. So identity forms through giving a content to our subjectivity. So our subjectivity is always just an empty form. And identity is necessary. We have to have a symbolic identity. There's no doing without it. But identity politics makes identity into a ground for our being. And that's what distinguishes it from the universality of the left. But the thing about identity is that it's not just independent. It's not just based upon itself, even though that's what it claims to be. Instead, it always depends upon some non-identity that it attributes to the other. So, as someone occupying a certain identity, my enjoyment of that identity comes from those who don't share my identity. So, those who are outside, who have a different identity, are the source of my own enjoyment of my identity. So the focus of identity politics is always necessarily on those who threaten it or who threaten the identity of the person invested in identity politics. If I'm a fundamentalist Christian, for instance, this might be secular atheists, it might be Islamic fundamentalists, but it's some external group that threatens my identity as fundamentalist Christian. Here's one of the great figures of identity politics. And he makes this pretty clear in Mein Kampf, his only book. In general, the art of all truly great national leaders at all times consists, among other things, primarily in not dividing the attention of a people, but in concentrating it upon a single foe. So this is an important idea, that identity becomes enjoyable when the opponent of it is identified by a single appellation, a single name. And this also becomes clear in the thought of Carl Schmitt, who was himself also a Nazi. Schmitt developed, very importantly, the idea of the friend-enemy distinction. And this distinction for Schmitt means that we constitute ourselves as political beings through our relationship to an enemy. So we need an enemy in order to have ourselves as a political entity. And I acquire my identity through distinction. This is Schmitt's idea. So without the distinction, without the enemy, then I cease to be. At least you could say I cease to be in political terms. There's a nice Western by the great director Delmar Daves called Broken Arrow, which shows this dynamic at work pretty well. So the Western depicts the Jimmy Stewart character, who we'll see in this scene coming up, face a group of whites who think he's not really white enough, that he belongs because he's taken the side of Native Americans, that he hasn't proven himself a real white man, but their identity as white comes through their attack on him. Let's take a look at that.
Anybody else want to call me a renegade?
I'll never call you a renegade, Jeffords. The man's a liar who says you are. But why is Cochise so partial to you? How come he lets this mail rider through on the same day he wipes out a whole wagon train?
Because he gave me his word and he's a man of honor.
A man of honor?
No Indian's a man of honor. The first peace move in 10 years, and you're blind to it, all of you.
We'll have peace when every Apache is hung from a tree. Here's your $300, Jeffords.
The drinks are on me. I don't drink on any Indian lover. He's a copperhead. He's owned this house. Bring him out. What are you waiting for? No, you have no room.
What's great about this scene is that it shows how intensely their enjoyment ratchets up at precisely the time they identify the enemy. So there's no enjoyment of identity or identity politics without this enemy that doesn't share one's identity. But this puts identity politics in a paradoxical position because it's constantly trying to destroy the other that it relies on to feed its own enjoyment. So the more it destroys the other, the more it destroys the very thing that it requires to provide it enjoyment. What's interesting, though, is that the destruction of the enemy doesn't eliminate the hatred of the enemy. It actually augments it. So the more the enemy disappears, the more the figure of identity politics increases hatred of the enemy and enjoyment of the enemy. So the problem is that one can only enjoy identity through this hatred of other identities. So there's no pure love of one's identity for its own sake without reference to another identity that one despises, that one isn't. And this is what I think one of the great masterful depictions of precisely how hatred of the other provides enjoyment of my own identity comes in Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, where he critiques this by showing each character repeating ethnic slurs, and you can see how the slur really is a source of enjoyment for them.
Dago Wab, Guinea, garlic bread, pizza slinging, spaghetti bending, Victimone, Perry Como, Luciano Pavarotti, solo meal non-singer motherfucker.
You gold teeth, gold chain wearing, fried chicken and biscuit eating, monkey ate baboon, big thigh, fast running, high jumping, spear chucking, 360-degree basketball dunking, titsoon, spade, Moulignan. Take your fucking pizza and go the fuck back to Africa.
You little slanty-eyed, me-no-speaky American, own every fruit and vegetable stand in New York, bullshit Reverend Sun Young Moon, Summer Olympic 88 Korean kickboxing Sabaran bitch.
You Goya bean eating, 15 in a car, 30 in an apartment, pointy shoes, red wearing, menudo, meter, Puerto Rican cocksucker? Yeah, you!
It's cheap. I got good price for you. May I catch you? How I'm doing? Chocolate egg cream drinking, bagel and deluxe, banana for this Jew asshole.
As the series of slurs shows, identity for each of these characters in Spike Lee's film is intricately linked to the identity that they're despising. So there's no identity isolated just in oneself. Instead, the enjoyment of the identity depends upon this connection to the other. The other thing that identity politics does is it's constantly striving for symbolic recognition. So the point of identity politics is, I want my identity to receive the proper, what I think is the proper symbolic recognition for it. The problem is, however, that it's the lack of recognition that actually energizes identity politics. So if we actually got the recognition that we wanted for our identity, we would cease to be driven to get recognition. So that would ruin the project of identity politics. So this is once again the way in which identity politics is at odds with itself in its struggle. So you might say it this way: the more identity politics wins, the more it loses. What this means is that identity politics is just a dead-end politics, that it leads nowhere and can never win the struggles that it sets out to win. Instead, it'll always find more and more struggles that it has to engage in, because the more it wins, the more it feels like it's losing. What's interesting to me is that we often mislabel universalist struggles as versions of identity politics. And I think this is a common strategy on the right, that leftist projects, which are really totally universalist, get labeled as identity politics in order to demean them. Nowhere is this truer than in the struggle of Black Lives Matter, which gets seen as a version of Black identity politics when in fact it's thoroughly an egalitarian universalist struggle. Because the point of Black Lives Matter is not some assertion of Black identity or the importance of Black identity. Instead, it's an affirmation of universal equality. And the point is that as long as Black lives don't matter, there's really can be no universal equality. So that's the key idea of Black Lives Matter, which makes it a universalist project through and through. The point is never, for Black Lives Matter, recognition of a certain symbolic identity. I think this is absolutely key. The point is insisting on equality rather than on inclusion. So inclusion is always a false road, and the universalist point is always found instead of, at the expense of, attempts at inclusion, which are linked to identity politics. So like identity, inclusion always requires exclusion. This is the problem with it. This is why there can be no project of universal inclusion that doesn't have some corresponding exclusion. The only real universality is a universality through identification with non-belonging, so with those who don't belong. And what's interesting is this is exactly what Black Lives Matter does. This is why the slogans that it takes up and that we see demonstrated at the rallies are "I can't breathe" or "hands up, don't shoot," both references to what the people who were victims of police violence themselves said. So it's a clear identification of the group protesting, the Black Lives Matter movement, with those people who are victims of police violence. So the people who, what we're not seeing is a demand for inclusion, instead this identification with those who are in the position of non-belonging as the victims of police violence. It's also interesting that this other call, defund the police, whatever that means, I think it has different significations for different people. What's interesting is that says, rather than let us become part of the ruling structure, instead change the ruling structure itself, rethink authority, or dismantle the authority, the system of authority. And this is an idea of universality through absence. I think it's absolutely crucial to understand that this is the key to the universality that drives Black Lives Matter and that contrasts it with the identitarian politics of Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro or Vladimir Putin in Russia. And it also contrasts it with the All Lives Matter movement. So All Lives Matter takes on the cloak of universality. But my claim is that actually All Lives Matter retreats from universality into particularity, which is strange because all seems to be universal. It seems to be a signifier of universality, but the all mistakes the universal for the sum of particulars. So all suggests that if we just add up every particular, we'd finally get to the all. But the whole point of universality is you cannot get to the universal in that way. In other words, we don't reach universal equality by adding up all particulars and increasing inclusion until everybody's in. Instead, we have to see that the all is constituted through the exclusion of at least one. So forming the all in this way, through the process of universal inclusion, always has to involve exclusion so that we know we belong. Because belonging depends upon non-belonging, any attempt at universal inclusion requires an exclusion. Instead of thinking in these terms, we should think of universality through identification with non-belonging, or with those who don't belong. There's a great instance of this in the disaster film World War Z, where zombies have attacked all over the world, and the only defense they discover is if you're infected with a terminal disease. So if you're infected with a terminal disease, the zombies don't attack you. So your very defect becomes the source of your immunity. Or very non-belonging, one might say, is the source of your connection to everybody else and the thing that makes you not eaten by the zombies. And what happens in this scene that I'm going to show is that Brad Pitt has injected himself with a terminal disease that has a cure, and as he's injected himself, he can walk right through the zombies and they do not do anything to him. This is a nice example, I think, of the way in which we get to this universal position through accepting our non-belonging, accepting this position that's on the outside.
He walked right past her. Like there was nobody.
I wish I could get people to ignore me like that, but I don't really want to inject myself with the fatal disease. So I think that would probably work. So the humans defeat the zombies in this scene, and ultimately, only by making themselves sick, that is, by accepting this position, metaphorically, of non-belonging. And that is, I'm claiming, that's what universality really looks like. You might say that there's a universality of non-belonging that we could contrast with the attempted belonging of identity politics. And this is one other way of seeing this struggle between left-wing and right-wing politics. And this is how we might articulate it formally.